Let's begin with a prayer. Father, as we enter into a subject tonight that is very difficult for the Western mind to even begin to comprehend, much less understand, I pray that you would anoint our minds and open us up and have us to receive what you would have us to. And help us to have an understanding of this so that we might, on one hand, be able to minister to those that are caught up in this tremendously satanic philosophy, and also that we might have that deeper appreciation of our precious salvation that was wrought by your Son. So we dedicate the next couple hours to you. Pray that your Spirit would teach us and that He would just move in a mighty way. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, tonight we're going to be talking about Eastern philosophies and religions. But before we get into that, we have what is entitled A Short Quiz on Egypt to Rome. And so if you would like to go ahead and begin, you can put your name on it. And I might mention, those of you that took the short quiz last week, not everybody turned them in. So you will have a 0 if you don't. And also on your homework from the first week, that homework assignment about traducianism and trichotomy and dichotomy and all of that, you can still turn that in, but it will count against your final grade if you don't. So go ahead and just take the test. Shouldn't take you just a couple of seconds, and then when you're done, turn the sheets over so I can know everybody's done. As soon as you finish, turn them over. Anybody not done? Okay, let's turn your tests over and we'll begin. If you get any of them wrong, of course they're just true and false, so if you get them wrong you know what the other answer is. But you want to be able to look at your test later and be able to tell, well, did I check that wrong and then correct it or whatever. So, you know, because you'll need to use these to study from, so you'll have to know what the correct answer is if you miss any of them. Number 1. The word hieroglyphics means difficult to understand. True or false? False. What's it mean? Priestly carvings, right. There are more than 500 gods listed in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. True or false?
False.
True. True. More than 500 gods.
Where's that from?
About 1,200 altogether, but the Book of the Dead, which lists the major ones, there's more than 500. What did you think the answer was, Maurice?
Well, last week I thought you said there was 500 in the Book of the Dead. There's 1,200 in all, but 500 in the book. That's what I thought. So there's not more in the book.
Well, maybe there's 501.
Or there's more books of the dead than one?
No. There's more than 500 gods that are listed in the Book of the Dead. And a total of maybe 1,200. Okay, number 3. The priests gained their power by being able to predict seasonal cycles. True or false?
True.
True. Remember the first main thing that they did was with the star Sirius would rise right at dawn, just a few days before the flooding of the Nile, and so they were able to predict that seasonal flooding. Osiris is identified with the Babylonian god Dagon. True or false?
False.
You're all afraid to jump onto that. False.
Was it Nimrod?
Well, Dagon wasn't a Babylonian god, he was a Canaanite god. And he wasn't identified with Osiris. Osiris was identified with Bacchus, or as far as the Babylonian gods, it would be Anu, or the historical figure of Ninus or Nimrod. So if you were thinking any of those things, it was correct, but not Dagon. Okay, Egyptian religion is very simple and non-contradictory. True or false?
False.
False. All right, you all should have got that one. Number 6, the Sophists were the first to develop humanism as a school of thought. True or false? True.
True.
They were the first to develop. Now, there have been humanistic acts ever since the Garden of Eden, but as a school of thought, they were the first to develop humanism. Kronos attempted to foil the prophecy concerning him by eating his herds of cattle. True or false?
False.
Okay, what did he do? He ate his kids, right. The mystery cults usually centered on the deities of vegetation. True or false? True.
True.
True. That was, the whole thing with why they turned into such drunken orgies is because of the annual harvest, and they would, as they harvested the hops or the grain or whatever, and that would be used to make the alcohol, and because of the mystery cults were centered on that vegetation, it was the whole life and death cycle of the seasons. And that was where the Nimrod and Semiramis worship and all of that just sprung up into just every different culture that we've looked at so far. They all had their mystery cults, and that's usually what they were centered around. Okay, number 9. The Greco-Roman gods were generally in the form of animals. True or false? False. No, that was the Egyptians that had animal heads with human bodies, but the Greeks, because they were so humanistic in their approach, they just made gods immortal men. That's basically all they were just immortal men. The only difference between them and the gods were the gods lived forever. In fact, in most cases, were inferior to men as far as their mentality and their common sense and things like that goes, or in a lot of cases. Okay, number 10. Dionysus and Bacchus are the same god. True or false? True. Dionysus is the Greek name and Bacchus was the Roman name. Okay, 10 points for each one, and we'll pass them in at the break. And I do need to collect them because I'll be recording the grades. Okay, if you'll open or turn to your outlines, we'll begin. Tonight we're going to talk about some various types and aspects of Eastern philosophy, specifically Hinduism, Buddhism. I included Islam in this, although it doesn't fit with the general mode, what we would think of with Eastern philosophy. It is one of the Eastern religions. And last one is Taoism, which may or may not be one that you're familiar with. But even if we're not familiar with it as a specific philosophy of religion, when we go into the tenets of Taoism, you'll see how encrusted it is in Western thought. So let's begin with Hinduism. First of all, when we talk about Hinduism, a lot of people have this idea of Hinduism as being an organization that has a set of a statement of faith with certain tenets that box it in, and this is Hinduism. But as you begin to study it, you'll find out that not only is that not true as far as present Hinduism goes, but when you look at the whole history of Hinduism, it's gone through some very radical changes from the beginning to the present. And so first of all, I'd like to real briefly just take a look at the stages of development, or the historical development of Hinduism. First of all, there's what's known as Vedic Hinduism. And this is also called the pre-Aryan or Dravidic Hinduism. And this is the religion of the Indian people before the Aryan invasion. When the Aryan people settled a long time ago, about this, just around the same time as Nimrod, when they were settling, shortly afterwards anyway, when they were settling into the Indus River Valley, it was already populated by some people of unknown origin, and they had a very primitive form of Hinduism that they were already practicing that developed into what we normally think of as Hinduism. This particular form didn't go much into life after death. And so what we think of with the preoccupation with reincarnation and that sort of thing really wasn't much to play in this very early form. They were into, it was animistic as far as worshiping, different animate objects of nature, and it had a very large pantheon. But it was more of it was kind of similar to some of the other idol systems where you were dependent upon the god of rain during the rainy season, you were dependent upon the god of sunshine when it was time to dry things out, and this sort of thing. So it was just kind of a simple form of idolatry. Then later came what's known as the Brahmanic Hinduism, which is where, as the Aryan people, the Indo-Europeans, as they settled into the Indus Valley and brought with them some of the things that they brought from the Tigris and Euphrates area, what we know as Hinduism, or at least the concept that most people have of Hinduism, began to take its form during this period. They were very much into magic and ceremonialism, though. They were into incantations and this sort of thing, in that the gods that were being worshipped before still existed, but they lost their power as contrasted to the ceremonialism or the ritualism and the incantations of the magic spells and stuff. That's where the power was, rather than in the gods themselves. This was also the time that the doctrine of karma and reincarnation had its birth. Its beginnings were in this period. It was also the beginning of the caste system that we'll talk more about later. And we're talking, I'm just real roughly guessing, around 2,000-3,000 BC. That's just a rough figure. 2,000 or 3,000 BC is the time period. The exact dates, they don't know when the actual Indo-European invasion of the Indus Valley was, but this is just kind of for a rough time frame. Okay, then it developed into what we commonly think of when we see the guy with the gray hair sitting up on top of the mountaintop thinking about his belly button. It developed into that type of philosophy during the philosophic period, and what we would think of as the philosophic Hinduism. This is when the group of writings known as the Upanishads, I'll write them on the board. You'll run into this quite a bit in your, if you're ever reading about Hinduism, Upanishads. These are several volumes that were written during this time period, and basically they are just writings about philosophy, Hinduistic philosophy. They had a monistic worldview, which is basically different than what Hinduism today is. Now, when we talk about monism or a monistic view, it's contrasted somewhat from pantheism. Who can give me a definition of pantheism? Anybody? Liz?
I could try.
Is that where God created and then left?
No.
The world to go in?
No. Doug?
Everything is God.
Okay. Everything is God. That's pantheism. Monism is similar, but a more precise definition of that is everything is one. Okay, it's an extremely natural worldview. Okay, monism is everything is one, pantheism is everything is God. Yes, Sherry?
Pantheism doesn't fall under this time.
No, this is what monism, now Hinduism today is a very pantheistic view. But monism was the primary view during this philosophic period. It was, and again, you know, like I said in the prayer, this is a very, when we talk about Eastern philosophy, we're talking about a very abstract thing. And it's hard for Western mind to comprehend some of these things. And so when we say it had a monistic view, you know, a lot of the things that I'll be teaching tonight, I don't understand. I mean, there are things that I've learned in a book, but I don't understand them because they just make no sense. And I don't see how people can comprehend complete nothingness. You know, to me, that's zip. But to them, that's everything. Well, their idea of this philosophy in that time period was they had a monistic worldview as far as their approach, but the end result was a very pantheistic view. And I don't really understand that conclusion, but their conclusion was pantheism, but their approach was monistic. And I can't really explain it any more than that. Okay, then developed what is known as the devotional or sectarian Hinduism. This is also very ancient. We're still talking several thousand years ago when these sort of things, and there was kind of a parallel in the developments. They were kind of like some branches of the same trunk. But this is where Hare Krishna, you know, Krishna worship, Vishnu, who we'll talk about in a little bit, is their main deity. And Vishnu, he is one of their main deities, and he has several avatars, which just simply means an incarnation. Okay, a physical representation of Vishnu is an avatar, and this is done primarily in the form of Krishna and Rama. You might have heard, you know, that when Gandhi was shot, his last words were "O Rama." That was his avatar of Vishnu, his incarnation of Vishnu. It's interesting that some of the very early depictions of Krishna as an incarnation of Vishnu was him holding a serpent by the tail and crushing his head with his heel. And that's interesting. And remember, you know, as we talked about this, how in the beginning, you know, faith in God was pure, and then it became tainted, and it just kind of branched out from there. There were still these remnants of, you know, and this, I mean, that prophecy was made before, and all of the descendants of Adam and Eve had a remnant of remembrance of that type of prophecy. And so as it became tainted and perverted, some of the truth of the original prophecy still stayed in there. Vishnu is also the equivalent to the Hindu savior. Of course, their idea of salvation is totally different than ours, but he is their their mediator. But when you use terms like salvation and mediation and things like that, it's totally removed from Christianity. You know, their whole concept of sin is different than ours, because they don't have a, you know, to us, sin is when we violate the personal holy God. Well, they don't have a personal holy God. So their whole idea of sin is simply building up bad karma. And so their idea of salvation or reconciliation is the steps to undo that bad karma. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit. Okay, and then recently, and we'll say recently, like in the last 600-700 years up to present, there has been various forms of reformed Hinduism. A lot of this had to do with the fact that Muslim and Christian influences came into India and began to meld with some of the ancient practices of devotional or philosophic Hinduism. And you can see that in the teachings of Gandhi and some of the others. But then also there are branches of Reformed Hinduism that are trying to go back to the early things of the Vedic Hinduism and the Brahmanic Hinduism, where it's a true Reformed Hinduism, you know, where they trying to a restored Hinduism. And so there's all kinds of these type of things. In fact, one guy I was reading said that you could even put Buddhism and Jainism, which is a similar, we won't really go into Jainism, but it was contemporary to Buddha, the philosophy, about the same time, about the 6th century BC, where Buddha took a secular view to his philosophy. Jainism was practically the same thing, only it was a spiritual view. It's got a little more religion in it than what Buddhism does. But these could be viewed as Reformed Hinduistic philosophies. Charles Braden, who was a professor of religion at a Northeast University about a generation ago, made the statement, "It is broad, it is tolerant, it has an absorptive quality that enables it to assimilate almost anything with which it comes in contact. And when it was officially asked for census purposes, what constitutes a Hindu, the only answer that one writer could find as satisfactory was this: anyone who says he is a Hindu is one." There is no consensus on Hinduism. There is no definitive work that says this is what Hinduism is. In fact, I could even go beyond this statement, because I have a relative who is into as much of what we're going to look at tonight as anybody I've ever known before. And when I was talking to her a few months ago, I says, "You must be a Hindu." And she goes, "I am." I mean, to her, the label didn't matter, but she believed all the things that a Hindu does. So I think it could go beyond the fact that anyone who claims that is a Hindu is. There are a lot of Hindus who don't even know that that's what they are. C.S. Lewis even went so far as to say, you know, we've been saying all along there are two religions, God reaching down to man and then man reaching back to God. Well, C.S. Lewis went so far as to say that man reaching back to God is Hinduism, and everything falls in some way or another within this category. And as we go through this tonight, maybe you'll be able to see that. There is one unifying factor in all of these things that we've talked about. As diverse as the various philosophies are, I mean, there are, you know, today you've got as much as you've got the Maharishi Yogi, and you got the guy they just kicked out of Oregon. There's a guy back east, a guru back east, and his big thing is sex. And it's a whole Hinduistic approach to sex, and that's how they arrive at nirvana. You know, and again, the yuppie cult from the West Coast, the Tibetan monks, and all this sort of thing. There's one unifying factor that holds it all together. And just a side note to me, you know, as I have dealt with people in the past from Eastern philosophies somewhat, and it seems like the one complaint that they've all got about Christianity is that there are so many religions. You know, which religion of Christianity are you? You know, is one of the questions that they'll ask. But I mean, there's more in common between the snake handlers in Tennessee and the Vatican than there is between some of these philosophies of Hinduism. And there are so many sects and so many diverse ways of looking at it. So, but there is one unifying factor, and that is their literature, which is basically in three parts. You got the Upanishads, which I mentioned. These are the books of philosophy. You've got the Vedas, V-E-D-A-S, which are the hymns. And maybe you might be reading in a book and it'll say something about the Vedic hymn. Well, that's what it's referring to, are these Vedas, which are vast numbers of works that are songs, hymns, that tell the stories of these ancient Hindu gods, which there are millions of them in the Hindu pantheon. And then, thirdly, you've got the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Hindu Bible. And the Krishnas? Actually, no, it's not. It's one of the Upanishads, I believe. I've seen that book before, and I'm thinking that's what it was. Butch used to have a Bhagavad Gita that he threw away. He asked me if I wanted to have it for this course, and I told him no, and I wish I'd have kept it now. But I think that's one of the Upanishads, the teachings of the philosophy of Krishna. But it might be one of the Vedas too, because it's one that tells the stories of some of the escapades of Krishna. Okay, transmigration of souls. Now there are basically two things that you need to have some kind of understanding on before you can even begin to understand Hinduism. And one is this doctrine of reincarnation or transmigration of souls, and the other is karma. And we'll talk about both of them specifically. Hinduism, at least as an Eastern philosophy, believes in the doctrine of transmigration of souls. Now this is different than reincarnation, in that transmigration of souls teaches that all living beings are eternal. I mean, they've existed forever, and in this life, birth, or life, death, and rebirth cycle that is continuous, you can become reborn in many forms of animate objects. You might be a man one time and come back as a lily pad the next, or you could come back as a bee or a dog or a horse or anything like that. That's why this supreme veneration of animal life in India. That's why they've got 180 million cows that they won't eat, because they're afraid they'd be eating their grandmother. That's why what grain they have is kept for the cows, and when the rats get in to eat the grain, they don't do anything to the rats, because that could be your uncle. And this is transmigration of souls. Reincarnation, on the other hand, is more of a Western view that has come across, and we'll be looking at that more next week when we talk about the New Age movement. But reincarnation is the idea that living human souls always come back as living human souls. You know, the Western mind can't hang with the idea that I'd come back as a grasshopper or a lily pad. But it's more palatable to the Western thought of the fact that I could come back. You know, I could be Napoleon in one of my lives and then come back as George Washington in the next, or what, you know, always come back as a famous person. I mean, everybody's always a reincarnation of somebody famous. Either that or you were the servant of somebody famous.
Did reincarnation originate from Hinduism, or was that just...
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Okay, so they had... So how does reincarnation... do they believe in transmigration of souls or reincarnation?
Who's they?
Well, I realize that Hinduism is pretty broad, but...
Which one do Hindus believe?
Yeah.
It depends on who you're talking about. Yeah, it's very broad. Most of the Indian Hindus, and when you talk about Eastern religions, and even into like China and Japan and Korea, most of their views is that of transmigration of souls.
I guess I'm wondering if reincarnation is just a convenience for Westerners that don't feel comfortable with coming back.
For me to say yes would be making it too simplistic, but by and large that is the truth. But then when you look at reincarnation, you know, you've got so many diverse views of reincarnation. Like you have some people who oh gosh, just the whole view of reincarnation. You got some guys who teach that there is never an end to this whole thing. There are some who teach that you have to, because of this whole thing about, well, if you're going to work off your own bad karma, then it has to be you that comes back. And so it is actually you who is, you don't, I mean, you're not Napoleon's servant in one life and then come back as a dance hall girl in 1880 San Francisco the next life, and that, you always got to come back as you each time. And then there's other guys who say, yeah, you even have to be in the same family line. And then on up into some of the Christian reincarnationists who teach that, well, if you don't accept Christ, since Christ died for all sins, they're just a universal salvation thing. So, when you die, either you go to heaven or you get reborn and you have another chance, or then they got the guys that are trying to answer the question, well, what about the pygmies down in Lower Slabovia and these sort of things that never heard, what about them? Well, they just get reborn again as somebody else, and then they, everybody at some point in their life always has another chance. And so there are so many views to reincarnation, but most, I would say 90% of all reincarnation as I've defined it is Western. Now, when I use the term reincarnation, though, I use it very generically. So if I might even be referring to the Indian view and just use that word. Okay. Liz was next.
Well, I'm kind of confused about the difference between transmigration of soul and reincarnation.
Okay, reincarnation says you can only be reborn as a human, dies and is reborn as a human. Transmigration of soul says that all living beings, whether you're a flower, a snake, a cactus, whatever, a human being, whatever, they're all living, they all have a soul. And this is, kind of going into that true pantheism sort of thing. And they all have a living soul. And so, depending upon whatever your karma that you have to work out, that determines what you are reborn as. Okay, Maurice?
So when they take a look at us and they say, what religion are you in Christianity, they're not looking at themselves as what type of Hindu are you? Is there variance in...
Yeah, well, see, because Hinduism is so inclusive and because it is so ecumenical, they don't really look at themselves as being, because they can look at Baptists and Methodists fighting all day long. Well, Hindu won't do that. A Hindu will say, God is love. And that's the end of the matter. They won't talk beyond that. And so they don't really look at themselves as being sectarian in the same way that Christian denominations are. Although that's not necessarily true. I mean, Gandhi was the victim of a sectarian struggle. And so, what happened here a couple years ago with Indira's son. And so, it's not necessarily true, but that's the way they look at it. And they see what goes on in Ireland, and they say, yeah, and they call that, they call themselves Christians, sort of thing. Deb?
The reincarnation view, doesn't that kind of, the number of souls are limited. How do they deal with increasing population, or do you know?
There are several problems with reincarnation. That's one of them. His question is, okay, if there are only so many souls, then how come there are 4.5 billion people on the earth today where there was only 2 billion people 100 years ago, and so on? How come you keep getting more and more people? If souls were eternal, there's only a set number of souls. How come you keep getting more? They do have some explanations that are very weak and very lengthy to explain, but that's one of the criticisms to it. Another one would be if souls are eternal and a person is only working out his karma, in other words, something that I did in a past life causes me to have to be reincarnated because of evil I did in a past life, I have to work that karma out in the next life, then at some point you've got to have that pure state. You've got to have, you've got to have the very first life, in other words. Okay, why did that life have trouble? Where was the karma that he was working out? At some point you've got to have a beginning point, and they don't have an answer to that. So there are many holes in just the very concept of reincarnation. Has a lot of weaknesses in it. Okay, we got to move on. Okay, so that's reincarnation now, and transmigration of souls. There are basically two foundations to that. First is pantheism and monism, which I've explained, and that is that all is one or all is God, depending upon whether you have looking at it from a Buddhism is kind of a monistic approach. where most Hinduism is a pantheistic approach, looking at it from a very spiritual, I'm going to get into God type of thing. Where monism is just strictly looking at it from a human point of view. And then secondly is the idea of karma. Now remember last week when we talked about the Greeks and the Romans, we saw that they had a view of fatalism, which basically is the idea that the fates, these three sisters, the fate sisters, they determined what would come down in everybody's life, right? And there was nothing that you could do about it short of outsmarting them. There was nothing if you were going to be struck by lightning on a certain day, it doesn't matter if you stay in a cave. All that day, the lightning's going to get in there somehow and it's going to strike you, if that was in the fates. That's different. It's almost the opposite of what karma is. Karma says that you have a debt that needs to be worked out, and that the things that happen to you aren't a result of the fate that has been predetermined, but just this karma, this law of karma, the debt that you owe as a result of prior actions. And since they couldn't explain why babies were born dead when they didn't have any prior actions, they had to come up with that, well, it had to have been a previous life. And so this is where this whole idea of karma came from. Sherry?
Where did we come from in the first place?
Basically, it's similar. She asked, where did we come from in the first place? Basically, it's similar to any secular, and I use the word secular as opposed to Christian view, in that the universe, if you're looking at it from a monistic point of view, you're just talking about the rocks and the gases and everything else. If you're looking at it from a pantheistic point of view, you're talking about the force, just the life of the universe is eternal. God is eternal, and we are all, everything in the universe is God, so we are all eternal. That's where it all came from. It existed. In fact, let's go ahead and move on. This next statement will explain it. Another thing on karma before we go on, though. Karma is cause and effect. Okay, it's just the Bible talks about reaping and sowing. Well, that's what karma is. If you drink, that's your cause, and the effect is you get a hangover. Okay, well, expand that times 1,000,000, and that's karma. Anything that happens to us is a result of something that we did in the past. The thing that happened to us is the effect, and whatever we did in the past, whether it was this life or the next previous life, was the cause. So that's basically karma, very simply stated. Now, the Hindu Godhead, they have Doug. Yes. But primarily, the whole, this road to nirvana that all of these things are going to, whether it's, your complete nothingness or just being absorbed into the cosmic wow. All of this is an attempt to not pile up good karma as much as it is to undo the bad karma. That's the primary goal. But good works are a way to do that, and especially when we get into the monism of Buddhism. Okay, the Hindu Godhead. Now they do have a type of Trinity. You got Brahman, or that. You see that in capital letters. Okay, this is the Tetragrammaton of Hinduism. Initially, and we're talking, like back in the Vedic Hinduistic days, they had this supreme god of Brahma. Now you see on your notes it's Brahman with an N on the end, but originally it was Brahma, and he was the one God, he was personal, and he was love. Okay? In the process of time, he became very impersonalized, and in fact it said that there's only one temple in all of India to him. And he became very impersonalized, and he received a neuter noun name. In other words, it's neither he nor she, it's it, and that's a Brahman. And so he is known by his Tetragrammaton, the very impersonal name of that. Which means, like when we talk about Yahweh, he is that he is the self-existing one. Well, that means the same thing, only impersonal. Is just a simple way of putting it. Vishnu, we talked a little bit about him earlier, and his avatars being Krishna and Rama. And then thirdly, Shiva. Now we could look at Krishna. Now Shiva is the destroyer and the restorer. And so we could look at Krishna and we could say, well, he's the Hindu equivalent of Christ, and then we could look at Shiva and say he's the Hindu equivalent of Satan. And it's not that quite cut and dried. In fact, there are aspects of Vishnu and aspects of Shiva that both make them counterparts of Christ in a certain way, as him being, that prophecy, but way back in Genesis 3. The whole thing about Christ being, the restorer and the destroyer. I mean, when he comes back, in Revelation, he's not pictured as having these little lambs in his sheep. He's got, eyes like a flame of fire, and his hair is white. He's got a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, and all this. So he's pictured as a very bad dude. Well, this would be kind of the side that's known in Shiva. Only he's looked at in a very, grotesque way. And his consort is known as, her name is Kali. Kali. And this is Shiva's wife. And in the Vedic hymns concerning her, they sing about the fact that she nursed Shiva at her breast. Now, where does that sound familiar? Where have we talked about that before? We talked about that with Isis and Osiris. We talked about that with Cybele and Dionysus. And we talked about that with Tammuz and Astarte. And we talked about that with Ninus and Ishtar. So every one of these ancient systems have some place where their female deity becomes the mother of her husband. And this is the case with Kali and Shiva. She is viewed as a very, very horrible being. She has a belt she has a necklace of human heads and a girdle of human arms. She is the goddess of destruction. And of course, Shiva being the god of destruction. Okay, it's interesting that these three guys, Brahman, Vishnu, and Shiva, are depicted in the very ancient statues as having one body and three heads. And usually with the inscription, the Sanskrit inscription, Eko Diva Trimurti, which means three heads, one God. Eko Diva Trimurti. Okay, they view life as a school. Life is a school, and the object of going to that school is twofold. One is to get to know Brahman. Remember that? To get to know him, or it, and what we call, or what they call, the Atman. And that's not reggae. The Atman, or as it's sometimes called, the Brahman Atman, because that's their goal, is to get to know these two things. This is the supreme deity, and this is the individual soul. These two together, once you get to know the Brahman Atman, it equals moksha, which is Hindu for salvation. Okay, so that is their goal, is to, once you fully understand, which, I understand nothing of, thank goodness. But once you fully understand this, then that's where you're at. You have a ribbon. Yes?
After you've been reincarnated enough times and you've worked off your karma, karma, where do you go from then? What is salvation to them?
Well, that's what, okay, that depends on what school of Hinduism you adhere to. The general way to put it would be to say that you are absorbed into the cosmic wow. You know, you become one with the Brahman, which is all things. You know, and so you're in heaven. You know, but it's not a place. There's no streets of gold. You rise above all of that.
Not an individual soul?
Your individual soul is absorbed with all the other individual souls that have arisen before you. Didn't you see that Star Trek show? Oh, okay. Well, again, that depends on the school. Some say that there are none to begin with. There's no such thing as individual souls. Buddhism's one of them. And they've got a term for that. But it just depends on where you're from. Okay, the caste system. There are basically 4 castes in modern Hinduism. There used to be 5, and Gandhi took care of that. And here you see them, the intellectual priests. Now these are the guys who believe that they have been through this cycle enough times to where they've got it all pretty well down pat. And so they are the very upper crust, the gurus, the shamans, and so on. These are the guys that have worked out the majority, if not all, of their karma. And they are the most privileged. Then you've got the noble class and the warriors. You know, especially in the older days, they didn't want just a regular person to go fight the battles for you because they weren't qualified. So only the upper crust were the ones that fought the battles. And this is the 2nd grade, or primarily this is the number 1 grade because the priest class is so small. And then 3rd, you've got the administrative class, which would just be people of means, not your upper class, but this would be your landowners, people that had a hunk of dirt that they could call their own, merchants, and this sort of thing. People that got by on their own. They weren't owned, or they didn't depend upon their existence by somebody that they were subservient to. And then 4thly, you have everybody else, the masses. And this is the low class now. It used to be there was a 5th class known as the outcasts or the untouchables. They were called the untouchables, and this was the scum. I mean, these were the people that were born with no hands or this sort of thing. These were the very, very low, these were the beggars that you'd see on the street corners and everything. Well, now they're considered part of the masses. They used to be called the untouchables, and that's what they did. They were untouched. The rest of society had nothing to do with them because they deserved to be where they were at because it was their karma that put them there. But Gandhi and his reforms back in the first half of this century outlawed the untouchable class. Okay, so as much as is possible to put in a nutshell what Hinduism is. Basically, you see on your outline it says the wants of man. Basically, Hinduism says that if you want it, you can have it. It's okay. If you want it, you can get it. Now, that's not what I have always pictured Hinduism as being. I've always pictured Hinduism as being this skinny guy with a little loincloth wrapped around him, laying on a bed of nails, eating glass, trying to shove a sword down his throat. I always thought that's what Hinduism was. But the true essence of Hinduism says that if there's something you desire in life, you got to go for it. You owe it to yourself, to your own self be true sort of thing. And so they have this broke down into 2 different paths. Each path has 2 different branches. You got the path of desire and the path of renunciation. Now, the path of desire, the first 2 is pleasure and success. The route of pleasure says that if there's something you want to do, if you want to go get high, go get high. That's what you ought to do. If you want to do it, you ought to do it. You ought to feed your flesh. The only limitation they have is don't do it at the expense of others. Of course, we know that it's hard. You cannot feed your flesh without it being at the expense of others in some way or another. But that's not the way they set that aside, and they just say, well, as long as you smoking dope doesn't kill somebody else, then you go smoke dope. And that's the way and it says if you want that pleasure, then you go for it. Hinduism just says go for it with all you got, and then Hinduism just sits back and waits for you to find out that that's really not what you really wanted anyway. And maybe you don't find that out in this lifetime. But they don't care. You got 1 million more to follow, and sooner or later you'll find out that's really not what you really wanted. Secondly, on this path of desire is the desire or the want of success, which would be money, fame, and power being the biggest one of those three. Money, fame, and power. Now, success is not bad. It's much more satisfying than pleasure. It doesn't give you hangovers. You don't get pregnant. There's just all kinds of things that you can get from success that doesn't have all the negative side effects of chasing after pleasure. You get dignity and self-respect and so on. But it still falls short primarily because of some of the problems with it. For example, there's no way I can share any of my success without depleting my resources. If I go out and earn $1 million and decide I want to share it with Judy, and so I give her $500,000, then I no longer have $1 million. So I no longer have what I attained. If I am ruler of the Western Hemisphere and decide that I'm going to give this South America to Margaret, then I'm no longer ruler of this Western Hemisphere. So there's no way I can share my power without depleting my resources. And so therefore it becomes very self-serving and competitive. Because the only way I can really succeed is to have it all to myself, and I can never share it. So it's always, leaving somebody behind. And most importantly, though, it's insatiable. It's just never satisfying. No one ever has enough power. No one ever has enough fame. No one ever has enough money. It's like David Rockefeller, just before he died, a reporter asked him, said, "Mr. Rockefeller, how much money is enough?" And without blinking an eye, his answer was, "Just a little bit more." So there's nobody ever says, "I have enough money." If that's their goal, if what they want is money, then that's what they'll always want money. If what they want is fame, they'll always want more fame. In fact, there's an old Hindu quote that says, trying to extinguish the drive for riches with money is like trying to quench a fire with butterfat. Just the more you pour on it, the bigger the fire gets. And that's the way it is with trying to satisfy the drive for success. And lastly, you can't take it with you. No matter how much success you achieve in this life, even from the Hinduistic point of view, when you die, you are no longer a success. You come back as something else. And whatever you attain in this life, you don't bring with you. And it's kind of interesting that the same Rockefeller, his accountant, after his death, one of the reporters came up to him and said, we would just really like to know, how much did Mr. Rockefeller leave behind? And the accountant said, all of it. So you can't take it with you. These things are regarded by Hinduism as toys. And simply that, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with a little kid playing with his little play school boat in the bathtub, and having his little rubber ducky. And, it's a toy, and he learns and he grows by playing with that. But if you have a 45-year-old man who can't take a bath without his rubber ducky, you got a problem there. And that's kind of the same way Hinduism is. There's nothing wrong with somebody going out and smoking dope because they just figure that's just a kid, and they'll grow out of that at some point during the cosmic, eons that pass on and on. At some point they'll grow beyond that. And so that's the way all this is. Okay, the second path, the path of renunciation. And there are two branches of this. First is the path of service, or the desire for duty. And this is the idea that I want to serve my brothers, my fellow man. And this is good. This is a very good one. You receive the praise of your peers, which in Hinduism is not a bad thing. It's good to be recognized for your efforts. It gives you self-respect. But it's still wanting to them, because that doesn't connect you with the Brahman Atman. And so the very last branch that a person gets to on the path of renunciation is that of liberation, or the moksha. That's when they arrive at their salvation. This is the desire for infinity. See, it's one thing for someone in a very carnal state like me to say, I want to live forever. But it's another thing to have that burn so deep down into your innermost being that you are so compelled and so consumed by it that you can even go lay down on a bed of nails and it doesn't affect you. You know, and that's their whole thing of liberation, and that's what their goal is, to be so transcended from this world that this world doesn't even touch you anymore. Okay, well, that's a very, that's the Christian's goal too, as we are being conformed in the image of Christ, but their route of doing it is very fleshly oriented. I mean, it's by you controlling your flesh. But you can't do it because it's not a mind over matter type of thing, because if you really want to go do something, but you don't do it because you want to attain moksha, then you're really not learning your lesson. You're really not learning that you don't really want that thing anyway. So they say, go for it, then and that's the only way you'll learn that you really don't, and that's the only way you can get to moksha. Okay, any questions? So basically, to sum up, what Hinduism is saying is, when you arrive there, you're right back where you were in the beginning, in realizing you can have anything you want, but that's the only thing you really want, which is really nothing at all, and you had it all along. Yes?
Saying asceticism then is?
Well, Buddhism is more, there are some ascetic views of Hinduism, but see, Buddhism is more ascetic than Hinduism, because Hinduism, asceticism doesn't say do it if you want to do it. You know, like you take the ascetic monks of Christianity, they take these vows of poverty, and even though they have those desires to go do things, or even if they're tempted with the various temptations what all men are come in contact with, they don't do it because they have taken this vow. And that's more along the lines of Buddhism and some aspects of Hinduism, but a pure form of Hinduism would say that if you have that temptation, then you need to go for it. It ends up in an ascetic thing, but it's because I don't want anything else.
If it's a different way of satisfying the flesh than, say, the Gnostics.
Yeah.
They're, because really the aesthetic, or Docetists, or they were all different branches.
Yeah.
This is a way to feed my flesh, and this is a way to beat my flesh.
Yeah.
So this is another variation of that same thing. Either beat my flesh, but they're saying, by the same token, though, they're beating their flesh and denying themselves for moksha, is where it's at.
Yeah. Did you have a question, Doug? Okay, well, let's take a break, and then we'll look at the other ones after we come back. Okay, before the break we were talking about Hinduism, and we spent half of the class talking about that subject because it's foundational for the majority of what we'll be talking about in the next half. So I didn't really want to rush that too much, but if we get to kind of skating over some of this other stuff, that's why, because we spent so much time in the first half on just one. Okay, Buddhism. According to most authors, and I don't happen to agree with this, but according to most authors, Buddhism is not so much a religion as it is a discipline. And the reason I say I disagree with it is because how many religions are there in the world? 2. What's the first one?
God reaching down to man.
God reaching down to man. The second one is everything else, which is man reaching out to God. And that's what Buddhism does. Whether they could look at themselves as being a secular attempt at doing so or not, a monistic attempt or a monistic approach, it still classifies it as a religion ever much as secular humanism is. So I classify it as a religion. It was founded by a guy by the name of Gautama Buddha in the 6th century BC. This wasn't his... Siddhartha was his given name, but he had it changed later to Gautama Buddha, means enlightened one. He was the son of a king, or, kings in those days were like a mayor, equivalent of a mayor today. But he was, he was royal. He was stuff. And there was a prophecy given at his conception, a prophecy given to his mother when she announced that she was pregnant, by a monk, a Hindu monk, who said that her son, she would give birth to a son, and that at some point in his life he would renounce the world after seeing a sick man, an old man, and a corpse. So he grew up, got married, had a son, and decided it was time for him to go fulfill this prophecy. So he left home and went on a 6-year quest, which entailed 3 journeys. And on the first journey, he met a sick man. On the second journey, he met an old man. And on a third journey, he met a dead man. And so he came back, and he decided that he better figure out why there is so much pain, suffering, and death in the world. So he went and set himself down underneath a bow tree and contemplated his navel for 49 days. Yeah, in fact, the whole term of contemplating your navel is a serious term, because when they do that, they believe that this is the, like the seat of your emotions. Well, this is the seat of your being. And so as he would sit and meditate on his midsection, he literally got him inside himself and, figured out why. And his answer was that he came up with, because. And from this is Buddhism. And like I said, he spent 49 days he ate and drank nothing, sitting underneath this bow tree, until finally one day he said, I got it all figured out. So he went back and he started preaching his gospel, and began receiving a few converts, and it just began to spread from there throughout India. He was never satisfied with the spiritualism of Hinduism. He thought that was lacking, and so his attempt was, because of, we were talking about cultural conditionings during the break, because of his cultural conditioning, he had this worldview of reincarnation and karma and everything, which is just as accepted as Spiegel catalog is to Americans. That's just the way they viewed things. But he couldn't get into this whole thing about the cosmic one, God, universe, the whole Brahman, Atman Brahman thing. And he just saw it more as a physical, horizontal thing. So he took the things of the foundations of reincarnation and karma and applied a horizontal philosophy to them, which is basically summed up in the 4 Noble Truths. The 4 Noble Truths. First one is, and I mean this, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. That means there is such a thing as suffering. Okay? That's how profound this is. Okay, Buddha, the first thing Buddha figures out is there is such a thing as suffering. The second thing, the second noble truth is that there is a cause of suffering. Okay? Cause and effect. Where there is suffering, there is a cause. And he figured out that this was due, the cause of suffering was due to cravings that men have. This is kind of similar to the approach that Buddhism or Hinduism had, but remember, this is secular. He believed that these cravings in turn were due to ignorance, which he explained in what is known as the 12-fold chain of causation. The 12-fold chain of causation, which we won't even go into now. But that's, by a proper understanding, we will overcome our cravings, which will overcome our cause, which will overcome our suffering. Okay, which leads us to the third noble truth, which is the truth of the cessation of suffering. There can be an end to suffering. Suffering does not have to be. We don't have to suffer in this life. Okay? By applying this 12-fold chain of causation and getting it down pat and having the proper knowledge and the proper application of that knowledge, then we no longer have the cause of suffering, and since there's no longer a cause, there's no longer an effect, and so there's no longer suffering. And that brings us to the fourth noble truth, which is the truth that there is a way to the cessation of suffering. And that is by applying everything I said so far. This is done by a comprehensive system of moral cultivation that is found in the Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, so you got the Four Noble Truths and then the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, basically, these are, and we won't spend a lot of time on them, but just if you can just understand the mindset that's behind this. You don't really have to be able to walk out. You know, you're not going to be tested on the test where you have to explain in detail everything of Buddhism. But if you can just understand where he went from here to there and just kind of get the gist of it, that's really all I'm looking for. Okay, the right views is the first one, and that is having a right understanding of the Four Noble Truths. If you have the right views, the right outlook on the Four Noble Truths, that's the first step. That's the first path. The second one is have the right intentions. In other words, my motives are right. I'm going to renounce sensual pleasures. I'm going to quit lying, stealing, cheating. I'm going to, and then I'm going to start doing all these. I really want to do these things. That's the right intentions. Thirdly is right speech. You got to learn how to talk good. You got to have the right vocabulary. And this isn't meaning good grammar, but you just got to learn how to. You got to learn how to be able to edify your brother man, and not tear him down, not say wrong things, but just right speech. There's life in the tongue, and the tongue, just like the rudder on a ship and a spark in the forest and so on. So you got to learn how to overcome that. Number 4, right action. These are the things we do. You got to show love. You got to show joy, be happy. You got to do these positive things. And then secondly, negatively speaking, you got to abstain from immorality and these sort of things. So, it's similar to number 2, but number 2 is dealing with your heart, and number 4 is dealing with your body. The actual actions that come out. Number 5 is the right livelihood. You got to have the proper occupation, the right means of support in this life. This would entail basically two aspects. One would be, you don't want to become a professional bank robber or a professional prostitute or work in a liquor store or any of these sort of things. That's the first thing. And then the second one is that if you were born, if your karma if you were born to fulfill this particular lot in life, then that's what you need to seek out, and you need to find it. You got to be in the right vocation. If you were supposed to be a ditch digger, don't try to be a brain surgeon. But then on the other hand, if you were supposed to be a brain surgeon, don't waste your life digging ditches. Work to your potential and fulfill the right livelihood. Number 6, right effort. This is kind of a combination between 2 and 4. This is, you avoid the evil state of mind and produce a good state of mind through practice of the big 3. The big 3, which is, let me put them on the board. You avoid the evil state of mind and produce a good state of mind, which is kind of similar to what Paul said when he said we are transformed by renewing of our mind. Well, you do this in Hinduism by practicing morality, meditation, and wisdom. Okay? That's right effort. And 7, right mindfulness. This is looking inside myself and understanding my feelings and my senses and what goes on inside of me. Just really being introspective, examining myself. being able to do this in a right way. And then 8, right concentration. Okay, this is the Noble Eightfold Path. The result, having done all these, is complete nothingness. I don't know how to describe complete nothingness. I wish I could. I have read, and I'm serious. You know, I've read many explanations. In fact, in studying for this, I don't just read what Bob Larson says about Buddhism. You know, I actually go and read what the actual teachings of Buddhism and the serious explanations of what their thought of nirvana and complete zip is. And I don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't understand complete nothingness. Did you have something, Liz?
Well, could it be like an emptying of yourself? Kind of like I'm content with nothing and kind of a sacrificial lifestyle?
Yeah, that's what it is, but I don't understand it. Buddha, if you were to ask him, basically it's a coming to a point where you realize nothing matters. If you were to ask him, well, I understand everything you're saying, Mr. Buddha, and it all makes real good sense, and I'm going to go home and start doing this right now. I just got one question. Where did it all come from? Where did we start? He says, it doesn't matter. Well, what happens to us, you know, where do we go with nirvana? You know, it doesn't matter. You know, and that's basically they take the entire universe and reduce it to insignificance, and man with it. You know, so everything is reduced to insignificance, and in doing so, that's how he becomes one with the universe. By it all being, you know, it's kind of the opposite, where Hinduism is very expansive, and we reach out and we become one with the cosmic universe. Buddhism brings the whole thing down to where it's just, you know, contained into nothing, and man with it. And that's where it becomes that very monistic view, where all is one. You know, not all is God, but all is one. And so it's in that respect, it's kind of an opposite approach. And I don't know how to explain it other than that. It is said that Buddha died. You know, okay, well, how do you know when you've attained this? I mean, is this something that happens after you're dead, and then you realize, well, okay, I don't have any more karma to work out. I must be in nirvana. Or do you just, is it, you know, does your awareness, because see, Buddhism doesn't teach in the individual souls. All the souls make up one. I mean, it's all contained in one, and so there's not an individual soul. I forget exactly what the word for that is. But how do you know that you've gotten there? You know, once you're there, how do you know? I mean, do you see this bright light, or you know, do bells go off or something? And the tradition says that Buddha was practicing the big three, and he was deep in the middle of meditation one day, and then just ceased to be. He just died, and he attained his nirvana, and so he didn't need this body anymore. Yeah, Don.
Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Yeah.
What happened? I forgot. It's been so long. But
Yeah, me too.
Oh.
It's been 20 years. So that is Buddhism, but yeah. Has anybody read that? Familiar with the story on it? Because it's been
It seems
good
to
20
kept
years.
coming back until it got on this plane.
Yeah.
That's what they're using.
Yeah.
Or level.
You grow a big belly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This all started because of man's fear of answering to a supreme God. So the first thing you do is create a non-supreme God and make it as simple as everything's everything and blah blah blah, and it feels good, do it.
Bingo. Yeah, that's it. As I said in one of the earlier classes, remember the Polynesian legend about that in the early days heaven was so low to the earth that men had to walk around on his hands and knees, and it was a very uncomfortable position to be in. And so finally one day there was one man who decided that he would push heaven up a little bit, and so he strained with all of his efforts, and he pushed it up to where men could finally walk just stooped over a little bit. And so he rested a while, and then pretty soon he pushed it up until where all mankind all over the earth could walk upright. And he still wasn't satisfied. So he rested, and then he climbed up to the highest mountain. And he pushed heaven up to where it was so far away that it no longer interfered with man anymore. And he was no longer cramped by heaven's style. Okay, that is a very almost cartoon look at what man has done. He did not want to be accountable to a supreme being. But he was created with eternity in his heart. He had that Jesus-shaped hole. So what's he going to do with it? Well, he's going to fill it with religion. And Hinduism, in all of its various forms of spiritual and secular approach, is the most effective attempt that man has had. And we'll see, like we're looking at all of the various foundations of it tonight, and then next week we'll look at what that means to us in the 20th century today, practically speaking, with the New Age movement, which is nothing more than what they were doing 3,000 years ago in India, they're doing today in New York City. Just got some new terms. And
These eight paths here, right action, livelihood, and all that, when you can fulfill all eight of them, you become a good Buddhist?
yeah, the term that they have is Buddhahood. Buddha, you attain Buddhahood. And when you look at the Buddha statues, you know that they're all not the same. And these are various depictions of like I said once about Maitreya. Well, he was a Buddha of the, I think he was around the 6th century or something like that. Now there are different applications of Maitreya. Maitreya is actually a Hindu deity, but that title has been given a couple times in history.
Who's the Maitreya today then? In Los Angeles Times, the Maitreya, the Christ is here and all this.
Oh, I think he's a farmer outside of Leavenworth, Kansas.
Well, no, he's somewhere in England. Same name, I just want to remember it.
Come back next week. Okay? Okay.
Kenny, you mentioned all the little statuettes of Buddha, and they do all have big bellies. Is this because somebody thought that he was big and fat, or is it because you said the essence of him was in his middle, and is he made big to emphasize that?
If I had to, it would just be a guess, but I would have to guess that might be an aspect of it. I don't know why he's always so fat.
Especially if he didn't eat for 49 days.
Huh?
Especially if he didn't eat for 49 days.
Yeah.
Fasting was a...
Well, that was only till he found out what it was all about. After he found out what it was all about, he came back down, yeah. He said, well, it doesn't matter. It's insignificant. I'll have another piece of pie. Okay. Any more questions on Buddhism? All right, Islam. As I said, Islam is not normally what we would think of as an Eastern religion or philosophy, although it is. It's different. It's closer to Judaism than it is Hinduism. But it is Oriental, and it has a lot of the same characteristics. The word Islam, interestingly enough, comes from an Arabic word salam, which is similar to the Hebrew word shalom, and it means peace, or more literally, to surrender. Let me repeat that. The word Islam comes from an Arabic word that means to surrender. Do I need to repeat that one more time, or have you all got that in your notes?
Got it.
Okay. I don't know why I'm emphasizing that. The word Muslim, or Muslim, means one who surrenders. Yeah, we'll talk about him in a little bit. Okay? Islam means to surrender. Okay. To understand Islam, or Mohammedanism, or Muslimism, whatever name... Now, Islamic people do not like the name Mohammedanism. They prefer the name Islam, Nation of Islam. But to understand that, first of all, you have to know a little bit about its founder, who was a guy by the name of Muhammad. And he was born around 571 AD in the Middle East. I think it was Syria is where he was born. And he lived in a very idealistic society. Christianity and Hinduism or Judaism had not penetrated into the Arabian desert very much. It had gone everywhere else, but it just really hadn't got to the Arabs to speak of. And they were still very paganistic and very steeped in their idols. They were very animistic as far as, you know, all animate objects were a manifestation of a deity of some sort. So they worshiped nature and all this sort of thing. And he was very concerned by the people's bondage that was caught up in this type of idolatry. When he was around 25, he started a very successful caravan business. And after a few years, he married a wealthy widow. Every caravan owner's dream. And that enabled him to spend a lot of time not having to work and run his caravan. So he was able to go into this cave at the foot of Mount Hira, H-I-R-A, and meditate because he had this rich widow supporting him. During these meditations, at one point, the angel Gabriel began to appear to him and began giving him this revelation from God known as the Quran. Quran. Q-U-R-A-N, transliterated into English as the Quran. He ended up, the word Quran means recitation. As Gabriel would give these to him, Muhammad would recite them back until he memorized the entire thing. It contains 114 chapters, and he memorized the whole thing. He was illiterate, so he couldn't write it down. It was his disciples who later committed it to writing. After he became really convinced, he went up to his wealthy widow wife and said, baby, either I have received something heavy or I'm going insane. And she says, well, I know you and you're not insane. And so she became his first convert. And so the two of them went to Mecca and began preaching their gospel, and it was not received by any sense of the imagination. Yes?
I'm sorry, what does the Quran mean?
Recitation. Quran means recitation. So Mr. and Mrs. Muhammad went into Mecca and tried preaching their gospel, and it was rejected for basically two reasons. One is that the people, because they were so steeped in this idolatry, it was kind of like the silversmiths of Ephesus. There was a very lucrative business around that, and they didn't want to give that up. So that was the first thing they didn't want to give up. The second thing is that these revelations that he was receiving from Gabriel were very moral, and the people were not. And so they didn't want to give up their immoral lifestyles. And so for these two reasons, he was stoned and beaten and drove out of town with just a very few converts. That began what you see on your outlines as the Hijra, which means flight. And this was him fleeing from Mecca to Medina in 622 AD, which is 100 miles to the south. When he arrived in Medina, he found a city in political turmoil and upheaval that was in a very big need of leadership. And so he came in and filled the void. And he said, well, what this city needs is structure. What this city needs is a very strong moral base. And I happen to have it right here. And so he presented that, and the people received it, and he became their leader. And in 628, which was 6 years after he was driven from Mecca, after being stoned and beaten, he returned with 10,000 men. And he just walked in. I mean, he turned Medina around, and he walked into Mecca with his army and just took over. There was no fight or anything. I mean, you know, what could they do? And he just kind of went in and took over. That was in 628. In the century that followed, there was a vast expansion that the world has never seen and had never seen before. And that was that the nation of Islam was spread throughout the entire inhabited civilized world, from Asia to the Atlantic, from Africa to Europe. And it looked as though there was going to be no stopping it. Their creed was the Quran or the sword. And much of Islam has been judged as a, just like much of Christianity has been judged by the Crusades. Well, much of Islam was judged by this 100-year period of its infancy. And it looked as though there was no stopping it. I mean, it was spreading like wildfire until 732 AD, the Battle of Tours in France. A guy by the name of Charles Martel stopped them, and that hedged the spread of Islam. But look at these dates. It was 628 when he went into Mecca with his 10,000 men. 732 is only 100 years later, and it had already spread worldwide in just 1 century. Just 104 years later. Islam is basically viewed or summed up in the 5 pillars of faith. You notice all of the different philosophies. You got the 4 noble truths and the 8-fold noble path and so on. Here you have the 5 pillars of faith. And these are, number 1, reciting the Shahada. Reciting the Shahada. Every good Muslim does this daily, or many times a day. The Shahada is the equivalent to, with the Hebrews, it's Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. To the Christians, you could say it was John 3:16. Well, to the Muslims, it's the Shahada. And that is, there is no God but Allah. And who knows the second half? Anybody? And Muhammad is his prophet. This will be a test question. You will need to know the Shahada. Yes.
What was the revelation that he got called appeared?
The revelation that he got is the Quran, which means recitation. 114 chapters of it.
It may be too hard of a question to answer, but we just talked about the Buddhists and the Hindus having a mindset or a predisposition or a cultural conditioning that caused them to fall into this. We're seeing something in this with that rapid spread, and I'm wondering what was their preconditioning culturally, or was there any? For thousands, maybe millions of people to recite that in so short a time, unless there was actual demonic pressure put on, or freedoms given, or whatever. How could the people fall for that so quickly?
As far as answering that, I don't know. I know why they do it now, because it's the cultural conditioning.
Yeah.
But why they did it, why it spread like it did, demonic, intervention's the only explanation I have.
Demon posing as Gabriel, why would he teach morality?
Because of the bondage that comes from it. Islam is a very, In fact, let's go through the other 4 pillars, and you'll see that. Okay, daily prayer is the second one. Now, Muslims are very fatalistic. So what's going to happen is going to happen. Like the Fates from Rome, the Fate Sisters. Okay, well that's pretty much the Muslim approach. So it's not going to do any good to pray to God. So that's not why, they're not into supplication, they're not into petition, they're not into intercession, they're into repetition. And it doesn't matter, as long as I'm doing it, and as long as I do it in the morning, and I do it at noon, and I do it in the afternoon, and I do it in the late afternoon, and I do it at sunset, and I do it before I go to bed. As long as I do that, then that shows God that I'm doing it right. You know, that pleases Allah, as long as I go through those mechanics. You can see the bondage that would be in. You know, well, oh gosh, I didn't do my noon prayer. You know, so you got to go. You know, Allah's mad at me because I didn't do my noon prayer. So that's, you know, everything about Islam is very bondage producing because it is so mechanical. Almsgiving. You know, that's the way you please Allah, is by reaching into your pocket. And so it doesn't matter what your heart is. It doesn't matter, you know, how worthy the person of the recipient is or how unworthy they are. And the fact is that I reach my pocket, and in fact, a lot of Muslim nations have mandatory, it's their tax. And just like it was for the Jews, well, part of their taxes is a mandatory charitable donation. Okay, fasting during the month of Ramadan. I don't know what month this is, but it was supposedly the time that he was in the cave receiving the thing from Gabriel. Yeah. June, is that when it is? Okay. I tried to find it and I couldn't. But they fast during, you know, which, okay, fasting for a month sounds pretty heavy, but they only do it from sunrise to sunset. And then after sun goes down, they party. So, you know, as long as I don't eat between sunrise and sunset, I've made Allah happy.
And all the animals fast too.
Yeah. Yeah, all the animals fast too. Okay, and then number 5 is the Hajj. The Hajj is every Muslim's desire, and that is to, at some point during their life, make a pilgrimage to Mecca. Mecca is their holy city. And when you get there, there's all kinds of fun things to do, like go kiss this rock that Muhammad touched and things like that, if you can get to it. But there's so many other people doing their Hajj that it's kind of hard to get up to it. But that's kind of what that's what the Hajj is. So you do these 5 things, and then if you adhere to this strict code of ethics that they have, then you'll be okay. Okay? The strict code of ethics is known by the title of the Sharia, which means the path to follow. And this is the, you know, it's pretty Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth approach. If someone goes in and steals, then you take him out to the center of the city and cut off his hands. And then he doesn't steal no more. And consequently, they have very few thieves. They don't have any with hands, but it's a very strict code of ethics to follow. Okay, there are various sects. Now again, here we are again, you know, looking at, I mean, there is not just one group of Muslims. And if you've followed any of the news in the last several years with the Middle East, you can see that they are fighting even among themselves. First of all, there's the Wahhabi. Now, you see on your outlines this W-A-H-H-A-B-I. Some sources I read only had one H, but it's the Wahhabi, and these are the Puritans. This is named for Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 18th century, and he was a very, he was a Puritan. He says that this code of ethics, this Sharia, has to be followed to the T. And so consequently, these guys are very judgmental of the other Muslims, and you know, they are very critical of a lot of, you know, for example, it's against the Quran to charge usury in any way. You cannot charge interest. Well, how can a bank exist without charging interest? So all of the Middle Eastern banks, at least the ones in the Muslim nations, have to call it something else, and they have to come up with a very elaborate system to get around it so that it's not considered usury, but they can still charge interest. And the Wahhabi just think this is intolerable. You know, this is a blasphemy. Okay, the Shiites, these are the ones you'll hear about mostly. These are the partisans. These are the ones who claim direct descendancy from Muhammad. See, when Muhammad died, he kind of died unexpectedly, and he didn't leave a predecessor, kind of like the Muslims, or I mean the Mormons. And so there immediately grew 2 schools of thought on who was to succeed him. One was the Shiites, who said, well, it would be his son, or he didn't have a son. In his case, it was like his nephew or cousin or something like that. and they claimed him to be the new Imam. I-M-A-M, Imam. Or the spiritual leader of the nation, their guru. Ayatollah Khomeini is the Imam of the Shiites today.
What do you
Yes.
mean by partisans?
Partisans.
Or by
They are a party. They are the ones who, like a political party. Okay, the Ismailis, they're a subsect of the Shiites. And I found varying dates as their origin, anywhere between the 9th and 12th century. There was a group of Muslims called the Hashishin. Which means hash eaters. And these guys would sit around eating dope and having a good time and nothing better to do, so they would go kill their leaders. And this became like a cult of Islam, of the Shiites. And the interesting thing to this is this Hashishin is where we get our word assassin. It's where the English word assassin comes from. And there's still a few of these around. In very, there's like a little bit in Turkey and a little bit in Egypt and a little bit in Iran and so on. Fourthly, you got the Sunnites, which are the traditionalists. These were the ones who said, no, the gauntlet isn't passed on to Muhammad's descendants. It's passed on to the guy that the majority of Muslims think it ought to be passed on to. And we will have representatives, and they will elect a new leader, and so on. Well, these are the Sunnites. They're known as the traditionalists. Their leader is called the Ulana. U-L-A-N-A. And 90% of all Muslims fall into this group. So as powerful as Khomeini is today, as far as the Muslims worldwide, he really leads just a very small percentage. And when he's gone, there's going to be a power struggle in the Middle East like we've never seen. And more than likely, the traditionalists will be the ones who gain control again, because just by sheer numbers, by majority rule. Okay, real quickly, a couple of subsects. We got the Sufites, or Sufism. This comes from an Arabic word, Sufi, S-U-F-I, which means wool, because of the woolen clothing that these guys wear. They're the beggars. And maybe you've seen these guys on TV, predominantly in Turkey, but there's some in Egypt. These are what's known as the whirling dervishes. And these are the guys who they think that their spirituality is arrived by whirling around, by exercising these certain breathing techniques that bring on a type of hyperventilation, invoking demon possession, although that's not what they call it, but that's what they're doing, the invoking demon possession, until they go into this ecstatic blackout. And in their mind, they've become one with God. I have seen this on TV. I saw like a National Geographic thing one time, and it's wild. It's very wild, and it's obviously demonic. There's not a whole lot of them around, but there's quite a few in the United States. This one source that I read was back around 1980, said there was between 6,000 and 10,000, because of this whole thing of getting into God, becoming one with God, and using an unorthodox way of attaining that is attractive to the counterculture youth. And so there's a lot of those today who are being attracted to Sufism.
What is it called? Sufism? Your root to that?
Yeah, Sufi, which means wool, and they because of their clothing. Okay, the Black Muslims. Black Muslims were founded by Timothy Drew. He was a salesman in 1913. He claimed Jesus was black and that he had been executed by white racists. In fact, originally the world was ruled by blacks, and because of the fall, God allowed, in order to teach blacks a lesson, he had allowed the whites to take over, but now it was time for reconciliation, that Jesus' atonement was to be complete. That was basically his teachings. A lot of them were based on the Aquarian Gospel, which was written around this same time, and is the New Age Bible, even today. He was succeeded after his death by Wallace Ford, who was a guy who just came out of nowhere and claimed to have that he was a reincarnation of Drew. His follower or spokesman was Elijah Muhammad, who later deified Ford, who was the reincarnation of Drew. Well, Elijah Muhammad came along and said that Ford was an incarnation of God, and that he was God Almighty, and they worship him as God himself. Elijah Muhammad was the one who first began to bring black superiority in a militant way, in a militant fashion, into the picture. Malcolm X was his spokesman, a very radical black during the 60s, who was assassinated in 1965. And Elijah Muhammad finally died in 75, and his son, Wallace Muhammad, named after Wallace Ford, took over leadership. And at first it looked as though he was going to be a very weak in compared to Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad as far as his leadership. And it looked as though the whole thing was going to go down the tubes. But the reason why you haven't heard too much about them anymore is because, in the last 10 years anyway, is because his main emphasis has been to downplay the racial overtones of black Muslimism and have them recognized as a sect of Orthodox Islam, which he has done. They are now recognized. He emphasized more of the strict code of ethics and praying toward Mecca, reciting the Shahada and this sort of thing, just being more Orthodox. Yes?
I know your time is short, but 2 points. One is, how can they be militant and surrendering at the same time?
Surrendering to Allah, which means doing His will, which is to make everybody Quranis.
On the word dervishes and that whole idea, it reminds me of some of the secular anthropology studies in Africa and South America and Central America, literally where the whole idea of oneness and nature and let yourself go kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. It's very similar to what you see in Jamaica and some of the voodoo things, only they're not so much into the magic of it, but as far as their get-downs, it's be a very similar scene, yeah. Okay, Taoism. Spelled Taoism, pronounced Taoism, as D-O-W-I-S-M. Was founded by a guy by the name of Lao Tse around 640 BC to 517 BC. If you notice, this is just about the same time as Buddha, just about the same time as Jainism. He's also about the same time as Confucius. So all of these are around the same time period, within a century anyway, within a half a century of each other. His name means wise old child, and this goes back to the ancient tradition that he was born an old man. You know, he had that wisdom of age. He is noted as being the author of the Tao Te Ching, which means way of virtue. And this is a book with 5,000 words in it that just teaches you the way of virtue. His biggest follower after his death was a guy by the name of Chuang Tzu in the 3rd century BC, and he was the one most responsible for taking the teachings of Lao Tse and spreading them. He taught that the Tao Te Ching was the source of all wisdom and the solution to all problems. If someone could just take those 5,000 words and apply them to their life, hey, no problem. A lot of us have probably never heard of Taoism. Or if you have heard of it, you know nothing about it. But how many have ever seen this symbol here? One black and one white, look like two teardrops, and then this would be blacked out. It's the symbol for town and country surfboards, symbol for the Blue Oyster Cult. And when we were on the mission trip in the East last year, we saw this everywhere, especially when we went into China. You know, I mean, you just see it everywhere. That is the symbol of Taoism. I'll explain that in a minute. Basically, Taoism is simple. It's very simple philosophy, and it can be summed up in just three things. First one is the three jewels. The three jewels being compassion, moderation, and humility. Compassion, moderation, and humility. These are what's known as the three jewels. The second one is what's known as the doctrine of the yin and the yang. And this is probably where this is the symbol for the yin and the yang. And the yin and the yang is similar to dualism. Dualism being the doctrine that there are two forces in the universe, one good and one evil, and they are equally and oppositely opposed. Well, that's similar to what yin and yang is, but not quite. Yin and yang teaches, first of all, yang is positive, good, light, virtuous, and masculine. On the other hand, yin is evil, bad, dark, oppressive, and feminine. Hey, I don't write this stuff, I just pass it on. The difference between yin and yang and dualism is that dualism basically could teach that one or the other could triumph. You know, you got these two battles, but you never know what's going to win. Yin and yang says that can't happen. In order for things to be okay, the yin and yang must be balanced. And you've heard, you know, and you can see that in the symbol. You know, kind of, it's almost an infinity type of symbol. They must be balanced. You hear people talk about my yin and yang being out of balance. Well, that's really, I mean, that is for example, okay, the third one would be the ki. You see that CHI? Sometimes it's spelled KI. This is the ki, or the life flow. You know, you've heard people talk about this aura that surrounds your being and everything. Well, this is Taoism. And, I mean, it's spread, you know, this is very entrenched in Western culture today. But let's say that I have an injury in my finger. Okay, my yin and yang, my life flow my yin and yang is out of balance, so therefore my life flow isn't operating the way it should be. So the only way it can become balanced is to eliminate this problem that I've got right here. That's where acupuncture comes into play. Well, you put a needle right here, and then that completes this flow, that balances the yin and yang, and therefore, and then it makes it all okay again. That is a very, you know, short, simplistic view to this whole thing, but that's basically what the philosophy behind it is. This is the whole thing where Pat Morita told the guy to focus. Well, that's what he was telling him to do. Concentrate, focus, get into your yin and yang, make sure they're in balance, and then, you know. So it's very entrenched in the martial arts. Yoga. There are various kinds of yoga, but all yoga is entailed in this. The one that we're most familiar with is what's known as Hatha Yoga, Hatha, which is bodily yoga. It's the yoga of the body. And this is where, through certain bodily disciplines, or by certain bodily disciplines, which could just simply be getting in a position that is the most conducive or the most comfortable, you know, lotus position for meditation, then you're enabled to contemplate your navel and get into yourself, you know. And so yoga is one of the means of keeping that yin and yang balanced in your life and keeping your ki flowing. This is the concept behind the Force. You know, this key, the Force of George Lucas is the key of Taoism. Same thing. Luke Skywalker called upon the Force as he was going to be the Jedi Knight. Well, Darth Vader called upon the very same thing. He just called upon the dark side of it. But they were both calling upon the Force. So it wasn't two opposite forces opposed to each other. It was the same force with two sides that must remain balanced. And that's Taoism. Most, and we'll get into this more next week, but most of your New Age cults, basically to sum up New Age, is you take Buddhism and Taoism and stick them together, give it some Western terms, and you've got the New Age movement. Any questions over anything? We've just got a few minutes left on the tape. But okay, let's pray. Father, Maurice was so correct in his statement earlier that being the selfish, self-centered, sinful creatures that we are, it seems like mankind would go to no extent to remove himself from accountability. And as we've seen tonight, some of the more graphic modern ways that he's done it. But then as we see, these go back hundreds and even thousands of years. And first of all, Lord, we want to pray for those that are caught up into these systems. That even today, the millions, even billions of people around the world that are caught up into these false systems from Islam to Taoism, and even the ones that we didn't go into, which are all just variations of the same. Lord, we pray for them. And we pray that you would rise up, even from among ourselves, people who are grounded in the Word, who are just sold out to you, who understand the philosophy maybe behind some of these things so that we might be able to minister. We pray for the missionaries, Lord, that are in some of these foreign nations, and pray that you would give them the gifts, give them the means, and that you would send them more bodies and more assistance so that your gospel could be spread throughout the world. And Father, we pray that you'd take this knowledge that we've gained tonight and use it in our own personal walks, that you would take it and use it and draw us closer to you as your Spirit ministers that precious salvation that we have. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
We hope you've enjoyed this video presentation. If you have any questions or prayer requests, or would like a catalog of available audio and video cassettes, please write. Our address is Teaching for Today, P.O. Box 2098, Wichita, Kansas, 67201. That number once again is Teaching for Today, P.O. Box 2098, Wichita, Kansas,